Bible is full of stories that we all know and love. But how well do we know them? The answer might surprise you. The Bible you thought you knew is going to dive deep into the exquisite details of the biblical stories that make them fascinating and transforming. In this week's podcast, I thought that we might linger a little longer with Jeremiah. More specifically, Jeremiah chapter 1 deals with the prophet's famous call. At the outset, though, the way Jeremiah begins is standard boilerplate for the prophetic corpus. This introduction lets us know that Jeremiah's father was Hilkiah, a priest who presided in Anathoth, which was part of Benjamin's tribal territory. That's in verse 1. As well, we learn that Jeremiah spoke during the time when Josiah ben Ammon was king in Judah, and later when Jehoiakim ben Josiah reigned in Judah. This meant that Jeremiah was around when Babylon defeated Judah, sacked Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, and exiled some of the Israelites. That's in verses 2 and 3. This was a fraught era, to say the least. Parenthetically, the stories of King Josiah and King Jehoiakim was Jehoiah's son, are narrated in 2 Kings 22 through 25 and 2 Chronicles chapters 34 through 36. The two differing views on Josiah's death at the hand of the Egyptians are worth the price of admission. These stories, of course, explain why Israel went into exile. As for Jeremiah, after this standard introduction, the text launches into Jeremiah's call, when it intones these dramatic words, "Now the word of the Lord came to me as follows." That's in verse 4. Obviously, the first speaker is the deity, here designated by the tetragrammaton YHWH, the distinctive name of Israel's God. This God pointed out that Jeremiah had undergone a prenatal sanctification. "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you, and before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you a prophet to the nations." This was a momentous divine mouthful. In this text, God could not be more omniscient, since the deity had this role in mind before Jeremiah was even conceived. Before even being asked to consider this vocation, God had consecrated this fetus before birth. Plus, the appointment was not merely to be a prophet, but a prophet to the nations. All this before Jeremiah ever sees the light of day. This momentous call evoked an expected response, at least eventually. Who could even manage a belief that prior to birth one's path was set in stone? What if one did not feel up to the task? Jeremiah's response was to turn down the summons for a simple reason. He was not rhetorically gifted, which is a basic requirement for a prophet. Jeremiah's response underscores these serious misgivings. "Ah, Lord God, look, I do not know how to speak, for I am only a youth." That's in verse 6. Perhaps the Lord might hold off making him a prophet until he was more mature. Being a prophet is a man's job. According to Jeremiah, both his age and his speaking prowess, or its lack, inclined him to think that God had made a terrible mistake. But the Lord was uninterested in Jeremiah's demurrals. First off, Jeremiah's claiming that he was, in effect, too young did not dissuade the God who had prepared him for this strategic role. God expects Jeremiah to go wherever the deity sends him. Furthermore, he is to say whatever God commands him to say. That's in verse 7. There is no reason for Jeremiah to be afraid, since God will have the prophet's back, delivering the seer if necessary. That's in verse 8 of chapter 1. Also, God touched the prophet's mouth and noted that Jeremiah would have no trouble being eloquent since, quote, I have put my words in your mouth, end of quote. That's in verse 9. As well, God had sent Jeremiah over nations and kingdoms to pluck up and to break down, to destroy and to overthrow, to build and to plant. That's in verse 10. This is to establish Jeremiah's prophetic authority. Jeremiah's argument that he was a young man and not a polished speaker did not sway God in the least. Then God showed Jeremiah two images. The deity asks the budding prophet what he is seeing. Jeremiah responds by saying that he saw a rod of almond. That's in verse 11. While that seems to be a strange vision, it involves a Hebrew play on words. The word for almond is shaked. The same three Hebrew letters in verbal form mean to watch or to wake. When the prophet sees the rod of almond, God notes that Jeremiah's envisioning is just right, since the deity plans to watch over the divine word to make sure it is effective. That's in verse 12. This is another indication that Jeremiah need not worry about his ability to speak persuasively. A second time, God asks Jeremiah what he sees. This time the prophet sees a boiling pot facing away from the north. That's in verse 13. This vision is perhaps even more bizarre. It appears to suggest that something is about to boil over toward the south from a northern source. The Lord's explanation is that evil will soon break out on all the inhabitants of the land, obviously meaning Israel, or more precisely, Judah. The northern source is surely Babylon. Babylon's evil intentions toward Judah are about to boil over and engulf God's people. This is an ominous image. But this frightening image has less to do with Babylonian intentions and more to do with God's intentions. God is the one who is orchestrating this boiling pot. Indeed, God is calling all the tribes of the kingdoms of the north, suggesting not only Babylon, but also her other allies. Before long, Jerusalem will be forced to see these various kingdoms setting up their thrones, an image denoting royal sovereignty, in front of Jerusalem's walls and against all the cities of Judah. That's in verse 15. It was one thing for a prophet to warn that foreign armies were about to threaten Judah. It was another thing to insist that Israel's God, Judah's God, had summoned these menacing forces. God expatiates about this dire situation. The Lord explicitly wants Jeremiah to let Israel know the reasons for this pending judgment. Quite simply, Israel has forsaken their God and burned incense to other deities. Burning incense signals worship practices used in paying attention to false gods. In fact, they have worshipped gods after having made images of these gods. Making images is expressly forbidden in Israelite religion. Even worse is when those images are of foreign deities made by Israelite hands. That's in verse 16. Toward the end of this chapter, the Lord tells Jeremiah to steel himself for the coming prophetic task. All the prophet has to do is follow orders. He need not be dismayed by Israelite reluctance or rejection. Should he decide not to obey this command to become an Israelite prophet, he will be in big trouble himself. That's in verse 17. At this point, God uses a series of images designed to bolster Jeremiah's confidence. God will make him a fortified city, an iron pillar, and bronze walls. All of these things are vital to withstanding onslaughts when an enemy attacks. These military images are apt, since Jeremiah will soon realize the warfare that is involved in what he is being asked to do. Not only will Jeremiah be pitting himself against the whole land, but against the kings of Judah, against Judah's princes, against priests, and the people of the land. That's in verse 18. Jeremiah's task will not be an easy one. A majority of the people have been complicit in performing idolatrous actions. Kings who think they are entitled and above criticism will resist with everything at their disposal. Princes who are anxious to exercise their own power will not want to be susceptible to anything that an upstart prophet has to say. Priests will have a vested interest in seeing themselves in charge of religious activities. They will fight any prophet tooth and nail to maintain their authority. Jeremiah needs to know what he is up against, and God is making certain that the prophet is quite aware of the path on which he is about to embark. Knowing how arduous this is going to be, we have a great deal of sympathy for Jeremiah's earlier reluctance. He will be in a situation where he is vilified, accused of treason, considered unpatriotic, dismissed as rash, blamed for being too negative, and the like. This will be no walk in the park. In God's own words, quote, "They," that is, the kings, princes, priests, and the people, "will fight against you." End of quote, verse 19. They will not consider you to be on their side, or supporting their interests, or agreeing with the majority, or being a compliant prophet serving what the king wants, or being a trusted consultant. All these groups against whom Jeremiah is about to deliver God's words are going to oppose the prophet with everything at their disposal. There is no getting around this unpalatable fact. Nevertheless, though the fight will be difficult, God guarantees that Judah will not win. God will be with Jeremiah. That will be sufficient for Jeremiah. By all means, God is asking Jeremiah to do what seems impossible. But God's being with the prophet every step of the way will make all the difference in the world. God will be on the spot to deliver Jeremiah when the situation demands deliverance. Throughout this ordeal, Jeremiah will need to keep this divine promise in mind. He may be a youth. He may lack some rhetorical skills. God will help Jeremiah to overcome those deficits. But more than anything else, the prophet must never forget that God is with him. Let me invite you to go to my website, faspina.com. It's being redone as we speak. Let me know what your email is so that I'll have a way to contact you when we go to the next level that we're going to be doing in a few months. Also, if you have a question you'd like me to address in a Q&A session, email me at fspina106@gmail.com. I want to thank you so very much for listening to The Bible You Thought You Knew. I have a question for you. Do you have a question or topic that you'd like me to cover on the podcast? If so, all you need to do is head over to Apple Podcasts and do two simple things. One, leave a rating and review telling me what you think of the podcast. Two, in that review, ask anything you want related to the Bible. That's all you have to do. Then, listen in to hear your question answered on a future episode. Join us next time on The Bible You Thought You Knew when we discuss Jesus' personal Bible. God bless.